Hello, ladies and gentlemen that are tuning into this. I wanted to start off by letting you know that this is not live, that this is a pre-recorded conversation. And today I am joined by artist, commentator, and writer Alexander Adams. Welcome. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure.
I know that you've been sort of in these spheres for a while. I know that you had been on with Pharaoh and talking about art, but I know that you sort of first came to my attention courtesy by one of my mutual friends who had tweeted out the article that you had wrote in Bournebrook magazine talking about the base draft, because it was mentioned in a stream we did in relation to certain medical mandates here in the United States.
Yes, I guess that would be Stephen Carson, Radical Liberation, friend of many channels, and altogether good chap. I did a stream with him a little while back talking about some surprising aspects of the art market. That was a great fun stream with Stephen and Mr. D as well. So yes, the base draft, it's well, I think it's coming for all of us eventually. What do you think?
The more I think about it, the more I think you have to have that choice, because even if you are wanting to stay apolitical, if you're wanting to not necessarily get involved and keep your head down, eventually, right, this regime, this governing ideology is going to come for you. And so you have to draw your line in the sand. And while the original writer of it, Mr. Spandrel, is probably talking about it from a much more racial lens, but I mean, let's face it, our current regime has a racial bent in mind. But the only criticism I've seen, because I did a video on it shortly afterwards, because I was rather inspired to just talk about it, because concepts are always good to discuss for people that are new to it. But the criticism I saw the most was, isn't this basically going Galt, but in the 21st century?
And how is that a criticism? Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't matter how much you just want to be left alone and you just want to grill, bro. They're coming for you. They're coming for in your workplace. They're gonna start interfering with your transactions. They're gonna start monitoring, all your transactions, all your larger transactions. They're going to start interfering with you medically and so forth. I mean, it's coming for you. You've got to resign yourself to the fact that, yeah, they are going to force you to become a dissident. However apolitical you are, you will be forced to become a dissident. They will force you to become political simply by adhering to the values and standards that you may have had and that your family may have had for many generations.
Well, I mean, and that's the other thing, right, is that sort of forces you into two camps. And I say that very broadly, because you can either be pushed into a specific direction, like I think many of us have into these circles and our conversations and our background of how we've evolved politically. But then, of course, for a lot of people, you have the issue of your ideas or this worldview that you have constructed through, say, your political socialization, who you interact with, who you discuss with. And it's very hard to admit that maybe some of those preconceived notions are wrong. And so the cognitive dissonance really kicks in. And you sort of just say, well, I would like to defend maybe the status quo from 5 to 10 or even 20 years ago, sort of that return to the 90s liberalism that you'll see a lot of people on, say, the intellectual dark web wish to defend, whether you're Barry Weiss or Peter Boghossian or the like. I think that sort of puts you in two camps where you're inadvertently or directly assisting those that wish to, hunt you down, or you actually put yourself in the camp of a dissident and start thinking about what needs to be done.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's the problem with going back to the 90s is that all you've got ahead of you are the 2020s. You're not going to go back to that state, because that state is necessarily a transitional state. I mean, all states are transitional, but it's necessarily heading towards identity politics, and it's heading towards wokeism. It's heading towards progressive, complete takeover of universities, or more importantly, woke graduates going into government and into media and into corporations and so forth. I mean, you're heading for that anyway. So even if you go back to the 1990s, I mean, but how are you going to maintain that? Because that was an unsustainable system. That opened the door to the compact between the government and mega corporations. So yeah, I mean, you might as well wake up to the fact that that's not going to happen, and it's probably better that it doesn't happen, because that would only ever be a holding position.
Yes, I mean, you're all that you're doing is putting, a slight tap on the brakes. You're not wanting, or even going in reverse for a few minutes and trying to change course, but that course inevitably leads to where we're at. There's this straight line, I think, at least in the United States, from sort of this managerial New Deal-like revolution where it's far more technocratic. We have plenty of college professors and institutions working in tandem to achieve this goal, or you face significant social, political, and economic ostracization. And that system never goes away, right? The New Deal and the ideology behind it is never repealed in America. And you're kind of seeing this logical conclusion as the ideology evolves. I know that people like, the famous libertarian Murray Rothbard discusses that, there's these debates about how, like, the Trotskyites went into academia and the Stalinists went into real estate, and that's why the Stalinists or the Trotskyites ruled the world, right? Because they won over the academic. And in turn, even if you go back to the 1990s, the issue still exists. Critical race theory and our ideas of intersectionality and that brand of feminism are well in the college system. I mean, Bell Hooks is still there. Kimberly Crenshaw is still there. Even if it's just, still predominantly in law schools, right? All of those people who are lawyers, most of our government is consisted of, litigators, barristers, attorneys, at least here in the US. I don't know how much the stats are in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, completely. You've got, intersectional feminism was, born in the late 80s. I mean, there's no getting away from that. And I think that, you had that wonderful meme, which you shared, which I was going to use for some article, and we searched for it and we couldn't find it anywhere. It was the conservatives' value one, and it's the graph of where you start off like saying, Oh,
the one with Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, the one.
Oh my! I couldn't tell you where I found that. Someone asked
where you start
me,
off saying, we're opposed to gay marriage, but bro, it's whatever. It's current. Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, we'll accept their gays. Well, but then you don't accept gay marriage. Oh, yeah, we accept gay marriage. Gay marriage is, it's obviously it's a conservative thing, and it's like, and then you go down the list, and it's trans kids, and it's and it's all sorts of horrible stuff, and you get the conservatives saying, yeah, but these are conservative values. Yeah, of course we support it. You just have to push the conservative over the line, and they'll say, okay, well, I'm drawing a new line, and then you just push them back and back and back and back, and they'll end up defending everything that they ostensibly opposed like 20, 30 years ago, and then they'll defend it to the death.
I think Michael Malice said it best, that they're just driving the speed limit when it comes to their progressive or liberal counterparts. I mean, when you both inhabit the same sort of epistemology, right? You're not really going to be in too much of an opposition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've said recently that there is, when it comes to like British parliamentary politics, there is only one party. It's just different wings of the same party. They all believe in the same thing. They're all absolutely facing the same direction in terms of equal rights, immigration, the green agenda, everything. They're completely on board with that. They're just differing over how fast they want to go or what their priorities are, but they're completely, absolutely the same in terms of principles, as much as they have principles, and the direction. You don't have any alternative. I mean, there are no parties that are viable that will stand up against these. So everyone in Parliament is essentially ascribed to the same set of values.
Yeah, it reminds me of this quote by Julius Nyerere, where he says, the United States is also a one-party state, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them. And I think that is fitting for most of the Anglosphere when it comes to our political institutions.
Yeah, I don't see. I mean, you're not going to vote your way out of it. They're not going to let you vote your way out of tyranny. In the same way that they say, you can't comply your way out of tyranny. You can't vote your way out of tyranny. So I mean, I've been an advocate for what I've called like a floodplain strategy. So you've got people who want to they want to separate themselves. They want to build, like sort of a castle rid out with a massive stone walls, and they will sort of retreat to the sort of the Galt's Gulch thing. But we're going to build a mountain fortress, and we're going to retreat there. We're going to leave all the rest behind because we know it's going to go. And I say, well, fair enough. Build your castle, but maintain a floodplain. You'll have an area that you will lose, and then you will regain, and then you will lose and you regain, and it's worth paying attention to that floodplain, because that floodplain is your first line of defense. Don't make your private society, your group, your village in the Highlands. Don't make that your final line of defense. Don't completely reject engagement with politics or engagement with law or with media. Use that as your floodplain to try and contain and protect your safe center.
So, with that in mind, I think that brings up a good question to sort of how do you get to that conclusion? I know that we were talking before this conversation had begun its recording, and we sort of talked about where we had gotten from A to B, and B being present. So how did you sort of get to where you are now?
Well, I grew up in a sort of fairly sort of liberal. It's an English liberal background. So it was kind of, free association, freedom of speech, freedom of, religion and so forth. And sort of you do your own thing, but you have to take personal responsibility. The state is not going to take care of you. You really have to work. So it was kind of, it's slightly more sort of libertarian than the American liberal. So slightly more towards that. And I sort of unquestioningly accepted those values. Many of which I still hold, but I can see how they can be manipulated, and I can see where they've led us, how they've led us to this situation. I think what kind of got me was it was the Charlie Hebdo massacre in 2015, and the way, not so much the Islamists doing what Islamists do, it was the way that the media sort of ran defense for Islamism, saying, if they hadn't published those cartoons, then this wouldn't have happened, for the sake of race relations, so we believe in freedom of speech, but for the sake of race relations or community cohesion, just don't actually practice freedom of speech. And I knew that's not the way it works. You have to defend a difficult speech rather than speech you agree with.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably go turn the time a little even earlier, right, with Salman Rushdie and the price that was put on his head after the Satanic Verses, and that's kind of where the real conversation kind of begins.
The government, the British government was slightly more robust on that. But they did completely capitulate. Obviously this was something that happened in France, but the British government did kind of completely capitulate, and they have capitulated ever since, because they've bought into the narrative of that Muslims are discriminated against, and that there is systemic religious bigotry and so forth, when of course we know that Muslims are actually one of the client groups of the liberal elite, which dominate our political classes in the Anglosphere. So it's absolutely not true, but they bought into that, and so they've been running coverage for they've been sort of excusing Islamist extremism, or they even started back in 2001, they were doing it for September the 11th as well, to a lesser degree, but it's got worse.
Well, the United States has a similar problem, although maybe not so much with Islamists. We have that problem, obviously. We can take a look at Minneapolis any day of the week, but when you have a government that assigns a protective status, it allows them to effectively run cover for virtually any actual grievance, crime, attack, and so forth. And the United States, especially, because we have a new regime sort of that's been established since the 1960s. You have a civil rights-oriented regime, this whole aspect of disparate impact and protected classes, in which it makes it very, very hard for anyone that you could say of a majority population to engage or discuss things in a fair manner, which of course is has had its consequences now for decades.
Yeah, and that finally kind of woke me up, and I thought, well, and I saw it as, at the time I saw it as hypocrisy. Now, of course, I understand that it's not hypocrisy at all. It's an absolute deliberate policy, although perhaps not consciously known by the elite, that they have these client groups and that they don't apply the same rules to them. And I thought initially, oh well, this is just hypocrisy. They're just favoritism. That's just favoritism. No, actually, it's actually part is baked into the system. It's the way things are. And of course, actually, when we take a more broad NRX view, you realize, well, actually, it's baked into all systems, even systems that you would favor, even right-wing systems, even nativist systems. But of course, at the time, I just thought it was hypocrisy. And so I started writing essays looking at the intersection between politics and culture. And and that kind of sort of led to a whole series of essays that I wrote attacking progressivism in cultural politics, mainly in Britain, which comprised a group of essays which became my first book, which is Culture War. Culture War, Art, Identity Politics and Cultural Entryism. And
when was that published?
That was published in 2019. The essays had been written between 2015 and 2019. Or 2018 actually. So it was a collection of 4 years worth of essays with some original stuff. And that's actually kind of like a transitional volume. I think when you read the third book, which is coming out next year. So the second book was Iconoclasm, which was essentially sparked by the iconoclasm in America in 2020. And the third book is going to be called Artivism, and that's about politics within institutions, specifically museums, and the way political activists are using arts funding in order to advance their political causes. So I think that actually if you read these books in sequence, you'll see the first book is me coming to terms with the fact that liberalism opens the door, is the handmaiden of progressivism. English liberalism, that is, not American liberalism. And then in Iconoclasm, you see, oh, well, actually, this is the result of all of those progressives getting into museums and into politics. And then in the third one, you'll see, basically a despair. The museums are going down unless there is an absolute radical rethink, and it really doesn't look as though they're going to be.
And for those of you that are listening after this recording, all of his links will be in the description, so you can check out his work and his books as well. And I think that brings us to an interesting point. I know that there's a bit of an age difference between us. You're older than I am, but how did you get involved in sort of artistry, the art world? Was this something that you always wanted to do? Was this something that sort of you just picked up? Or was this something that you had a set goal? This is what I want to be. This is what I want to do, and I'm going to do it.
Well, I studied art, fine art and history of art at university. Weirdly enough, I kind of started, I didn't realize it at the time, but I kind of started at the ground zero of political correctness and progressivism in Britain, which is Goldsmiths College. And that's a sort of liberal arts college, I guess you'd call it in America, in London. And it's the home of, well, the origin place of sort of quite a few well-known artists, most notably Damien Hirst. And so there was a big art boom, and it was very progressive, and I didn't really fit in there, and I didn't think very much about it. And I kind of went away and did my career as an artist for about 10 years. Actually, no, it's actually about 20 years now. Yeah, so for about 20 years, I was doing my thing, and I was doing a little bit of writing, a little bit of art criticism. But I was kind of distant from art politics because I didn't like politics. I wasn't interested in politics. I was making art. I was looking at older art and, stuff like, art from the Renaissance or the Baroque or so forth. And I was making my own art and exhibiting and selling and stuff. And then things were kind of drying up, and I didn't realize it at the time, but because I was a white man, I was being edged out, and I didn't understand this at the time. It's only subsequently, from about sort of 2015, when I realized, oh yeah, there's actually an agenda as to why, because I'd done pretty well. I'd had exhibitions in commercial galleries, in public museums. I'd had work purchased by public museums. So there was no doubt about my quality or my sort of ability to work with institutions. And then around 2015, which is actually coincides with me starting to write political essays about the arts, then suddenly things dropped off completely. And I'm not sure whether or not it's entirely down to my demographic characteristics or my opposition to state art and conventional politics that really precipitated my downfall, but that's how it came about.
Well, I'm sure it's a little of column A, a little of column B in that instance.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what kind of work do you do? This is me asking in total ignorance of me not doing my research, but this would be a great way for you to sell your stuff. What is your main medium, and what do you like to do?
Well, I'm primarily a painter and draftsman. If anyone actually buys either of my books, you'll find my illustrations. I illustrated the covers, and I've done illustrations inside. Do paintings and drawings, different subjects. It's actually apolitical. It's kind of. I think it's a useful warning for people to see how my apolitical art has been basically blacklisted because of the occasional political essays that I've written as the creator. There's not actually a direct link between my turn against electoral politics and mainstream parties with my art, because my art is quite realistic. I generally work in black and white, painting figures, landscapes, nudes, some portraits. If anyone's interested, you can find my art on alexanderadams.art, and that's a website with my art.
Well, wonderful, and I'm making sure that everyone can have a chance to see that. And like we said before, one of your pieces will be sort of the backdrop for our conversation today when it comes out. And so, I mean, that's the interesting thing, right, is that a lot of us have a similar evolution where you can really start to feel the pot boil beneath you, so to speak, especially as you sort of go to both university and see how that ideology doesn't just stay in the university. I think there's a lot of cope when it comes around to, say, older parents and a lot of, like, say, politically minded Gen Xers and boomers that will say things along the lines of, well, this won't stand, or none of these views will hold up in the real world, which I think tells you just how far and disassociated a lot of these people are from reality, because that stuff carries over. It doesn't leave. It doesn't stay inside the university. Those people get jobs. Those people become HR office managers. They become activists. They don't go away. And I mean, I feel like we're sort of seeing a repeat of history, even both from the internet, but also sort of like the normative, right, the normie right-wing reaction to things where, 10 years ago, there were people making fun of Tumblr and the pronoun game, or these obscure identities. And, those people went to college, and those people and their language and their worldview dominate every HR office in the Western world. And we're sort of seeing the reaction to Generation Z on TikToks and the like. And the same thing is happening once more.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I was looking at cultural entryism in my first book, I noticed that, it's been observed by other people as well, that, if you're a company that's large enough to have an HR department, then that is the source of your infection. That's how the POS is going to get in. And when I saw that, I hadn't realized quite the influence of ESG, which is environmental and social governance. I've only recently discovered this in the last few weeks, and this was a piece of legislation that Obama passed in 2015, which said basically that pension funds were no longer duty-bound to use the only criterion for investment as profitability. So therefore, they could actually invest in funds, in companies, in sort of various organizations that also had a social function, so basically social justice, or environmental. So they were sort of eco-activist organizations. And I didn't realize, and I don't think anyone at the time realized, that what was going to happen was this would lead to a massive influx of finance into companies that were displaying woke credentials. And that's why you saw the rise of woke corporatism. We thought it was all a cultural change. It was a generational change. It was partly that, but it was also partly driven by money, because you had companies that were no longer, for example, I took as a test case Comicsgate, which is kind of like it's like all these gate events that you see in popular culture, where you have woke activists going into a pop art field, popular culture field, and then they start to influence it. They start to change the culture, and they say, we don't feel suitably represented, and then they get established in companies, and then they become writing company policies, and then they start excluding and gatekeeping and so forth, and they basically take over. They parasitize the entire industry, and they drive away a lot of fans, and that is obviously it's to do with culture and to do with Gen X achieving positions of power, and also the influence of social media. But what I didn't realize was it's also this ESG stuff, which incentivized companies not so much to prioritize profitability by selling products to customers, by providing fans with products that they wanted. It became a desperate attempt to attract capital investment from firms, specifically by using their products to signal their woke credentials, their representative credentials, their diversity, inclusion, and equity credentials. And I hadn't realized that.
Yeah, and I mean, you're right to say that a lot of the popular culture is a good way to signal, because of course it's the most mass consumed aspect of sort of our lives and transactions. But no, I mean, you're also right in terms of how these policies will mandate and sort of encourage this behavior. I mean, in the United States with Barack Obama, just like his Dear Colleague letter, right, when it comes to sexual harassment and assault on college campuses, you get the infamous mattress girl and the myriad of stories about how even the slightest grievance, and it doesn't even have to be related to sort of intimate relations anymore. It can be just about hazing. It can be about bullying or unwanted comments. Not even in a catcalling sense.
So-called exclusionary language or anything.
Yeah, exactly. And it can bring you a boatload of trouble with sort of the what they call like the student grievance center, because none of this works within the confines of the law. There's almost this entirely extrajudicial ideological kangaroo court inside American colleges, and it is to a point where unless you seriously bring a lawyer with you, you are going to defend yourself against a system that has already deemed you guilty before you can even prove innocence. And I can speak to some experience with this. In my college years, I was working as a legal assistant, working on paralegal certification. I had a desire to go to law school, and I was on my university speech and debate team, and I was accused of hazing and harassment by a former teammate who, needless to say, was quite annoying and was quite irritating, but never did I deal with her in such a way. I tried my best to just ignore her. And I was like, oh, you need to show up to the Student Grievance Center. And me being somewhat politically aware that there's no legal recourse available, I just asked my boss to come with me. She was an attorney, and I was like, hey, I'm in a situation where without, counsel present, I'm going to be pretty much screwed. And so we went in, we recorded the conversation between the grievance officers and the line of questioning. I didn't really say a word outside of what I was being asked. My boss had asked most of the questions as well. And, if you bring an attorney, I was never contacted again, and the case was dropped in 2 weeks. But most men don't do that. Most men don't have that connection. And this does primarily target men, especially straight white men, as we know, is the de facto public enemy number one of these institutions and their ideas. But no, I mean, you're right. And I think that sort of lends to a lot of the evolution of how we understand things, because is very much I think that in the last several years, since a lot of this has started, the distinction between what is a public and private entity has been more or less erased, because you do have an ideology that, mandates the culture, both within these private entities, so to speak, but also in government, and they work very much hand in hand. I mean, in the United States, even if you own a small local mom and pop brick and mortar store, you're still interacting with the federal government in more ways than your grandparents could have ever imagined. And because of this intrinsic link between, state, local, and the federal government in the United States, it is all but impossible to escape the culture war. You are brought into the battle whether you like it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one of the reasons the cultural book will seem a little bit dated is that you'll find sort of, I triumphantly define sort of go woke, get broke. And of course, now, we understand ESG. We realize, no, that's not the case at all. Go woke, get investment. And obviously I think you learn more over time, and more and more I see this book as a good introduction to the qualities of woke, of the woke future that's coming. And I do agree about the distinction between state and private companies sort of being completely erased, and I think I think it's very interesting that you see the left suddenly becoming big fans of Big Pharma and Amazon and stuff, and because they realize that they can get their universal income, they can get their universal credit and whatever best once corporations team up with government, and they realize that the government actually isn't sort of fascist, but it isn't a sort of an extremist right-wing nationalist organization. It's actually a deeply paternalistic, socialist, left-wing, minority favoring entity. And I think that even leftists actually recognize that even under a conservative or under a Republican government, that this is the case. That's why they're no longer afraid of big government.
Well, and we can get into the big government, small government question in a bit, but no, you're right on that end, because once corporate power has a certain way of doing it, but it also goes back to what we were mentioning earlier about signaling to others that it's a form of virtue signaling, and I've recently come to terms with the fact, recently, but I mean, the fact is that go woke, go broke, I think, is some sort of copium for sort of, anti-woke, anti-SJW, that evolution of cultural commentators, especially on YouTube, where they'll be like, oh, well, they lost a bunch of money today. I think that proves if you go broke, you go woke, you'll go broke. But those companies are still in business, right? The National Football League.
And you look at the stock prices of Gillette went down, but then it's gone up since, and Nike goes down when they start endorsing Black Lives Matter, but then it goes up again, and it's not. And but I mean, we were foolishly enough looking at the sort of the free market aspect and thinking, logically this isn't going to pan out. You can do this for a little bit, but then reality will bite, and you'll have to start supplying the fans with what they want. Because of just the sheer economics, you're not going to be able to carry on making a loss or having a reduced profit. But no, if you're getting money from elsewhere, if you're getting money through investment, through capital investment, then you don't need to care about the fans or the customers so much.
On top of that, right, it's an excellent way to virtue signal to the right people that your company is worthy of having their products sold or for more investment. I mean, if you take a look at some of the iconography that has come out in some advertisings for a while, you'll sort of see this idea of the perpetual revolution, where if the left, which I think they seize virtually, and they have had virtually all levers of power, and very recently I think they have managed to take all of them. Even with all levers of power, the dominant cultural product and ideology and the epistemology of what we consider woke, or I just like to call it the governing ideology. They'll still believe in this idea of perpetual revolution, and they'll try and show that there are still more battles to fight, that they're just one product away, one election away. I mean, for instance, here in the US, there are two companies that immediately come to mind, and I did a video on this about woke capital. And of all companies I used is this it's not a little pizza company, but it's like worth billions of dollars. It's called Little Caesars. And they are known for relatively inexpensive, not the world's best quality, but you can show up at any store, pick one up, and then just leave. And they recently ran an advertising campaign putting themselves as the little guy against a large, massive, ugly, brutalist architecture of like corporate boardrooms talking about how Big Pizza wants to raise prices and that they're evil. And they're like, well, we're not Big Pizza, we're Little Caesars. And it's meant, of course, immediately in your mind, like, like this David versus Goliath battle, this idea of we'll take down those corporate overlords and we'll smash them through and we'll be the ones that succeed. And then on top of that, there's this like Mint Mobile company in the US for like a cell phone carrier. And they're doing the exact same advertising run, but literally a depiction of Satan sits on the corporate boardroom of their competition. And it's just like, okay, at what point, right, does this become blatantly obvious that this isn't just to be a comedic form of advertising. This isn't meant to be like, oh, ha, 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 my competition is evil. It is, no, we genuinely believe in this sort of like revolutionary mindset. We are virtue signaling for more capital, and we will tell consumers that share our ideology that we're the good guys, and if you go anywhere else, you're not with the in-group of the governing ideology. Because I've noticed that they've stopped calling themselves woke these days.
Yeah, I think it's very much suddenly, we've always had tribal politics, but now we've got sort of tribal brand loyalty. And I think that was one of the reasons why I used to watch, or at least listen to, radio commentaries on football, what Americans would call soccer. And I used to listen quite a bit to like sort of the big games in the Premier League. So, Liverpool was my team because it was sort of the closest city to where I used to live. And but then I started to realize, well, actually, people, they just have loyalty to the brand. The brand doesn't have any loyalty to them. Liverpool has, 2, 3, maybe 4 players in their squad who are actually locals. And, the rest are all sort of, hired mercenaries. And, because obviously players go to where they get the most money, but they do have sort of like personal attachments to places. But then, you get international players as well. And I just felt like, well, these teams that are sort of absorbing our loyalty, they don't have any loyalty to the city. Or, I know it's even literally the case in America that you have franchises where a team can be the so-and-so Raiders, and then they get bought up and they get moved to a different city, and they're the so-and-so Raiders after that,
Yeah, and I can relate in terms of watching sports and such. My father hails from the state of Wisconsin, so his family side is there. So the team in Wisconsin is the Green Bay Packers, named after the city in Green Bay. And, you enjoy it and you can like it. But over the last, 3 or 4 years now, and it's gotten progressively more political to a point where even my, boomer conservative father won't watch a football game. He'll pay attention to the score and be like, okay, that's great, but I'm not going to give them the views. And you notice those things. But unfortunately, right, too many still are enjoying those things, whether it's American football or even Formula One has been infected due to Lewis Hamilton's politics.
Oh yes, yeah. It's pretty. It is bad. So this is a point of division over what academic agent calls the Tory Boys. So the Tory Boys, or or derogatory calls sort of bulldog nationalists or biscuit tin traditionalists. Their view is, well, the way that we form a national identity is by rallying around common points that we can all share and come together with in sort of apolitical union. So, for example, the monarchy, I guess the church. I mean, that's kind of like a bit of a live wire because not everyone's member of the Church of England, which is a Protestant church. And there's fewer and fewer every year. But sport, sport is the one thing that we can unite under. So we can all cheer on our boys. But then I'm not going to cheer on any team that kneels for a black left-wing political movement. I'm just not going to do it, and I'm not even going to watch it.
Yeah, and I mean, I think most people who are subscribed to this channel who will know who the Tory Boys are. Most of them are not American who are subbed, but the thing right about that is that there's always this argument about bread and circuses, right? And that people will always pay more attention to the circuses rather than the bread.
Yeah. To
a point now, even right in the United States, where we've got inflation that we haven't seen in decades, but we're still talking about, the petty cultural politics of certain things. Not to say that we shouldn't, but, there's some bigger issues right in front of you. And you had mentioned Comicsgate earlier. I mean, what a great way to sort of determine what got people more involved in politics than sort of like the OG gate itself in the 21st century, which is the whole Gamergate saga.
Yes.
And that got millions of people involved because it was this rather apolitical environment around 2013, 2014, which, I mean, it had some issues that was politically minded, but I mean, it wasn't overt. And then all of a sudden, we're going to put, your stock fat, ugly feminism inside a relatively male dominated space that had nothing really to do with politics, just a specific genre of people. And everyone got up in arms. But I mean, the other thing to take away from that, right, is that it's been 7 years now since really Gamergate started. And, they won. I mean, video games and most cultural facets like it are more political than ever. I mean, you can take a look at, say, what was it, Battlefield 5? It was a World War II oriented game. And it was, we're going to have this female sniper with like a prosthetic arm leading the charge and shooting, a bunch of Nazis. And it's like, okay, yes, there were people who were women who had, issues that fought. But I mean, there's no way in hell, right, that they're on the front line and we're having this rather diverse cast and we're not being historically accurate. We're doing all of these things to implement narratives that don't fit with what is historically accurate. And I mean, 7 years on, right, we're having Todd Howard, of all people, in interviews saying, well, in our latest RPG, you can be non-binary, choose your own pronouns. I mean, this is a total point of historical analysis, right? And within 7 years, they won. All of this pushback, all of those videos of commentators saying, we will stop them. Well, obviously we didn't.
Well, I think the thing is that I think initially it did look like a victory. It looked like the Comicsgate had won the battle, but they actually ended up losing the war. Or maybe they won the war but ended up losing the peace that followed. Because I mean, it's just been a complete slide towards the takeover of progressivism in every field in arts, and I mean that has obviously energized a lot of people. It got a lot of normies interested because obviously it infringed on people's sort of a relatively apolitical area of entertainment and relaxation and also community, because they were sort of making friends with people they were playing with online and so forth, and it energized people like, I mean, for example, Carl Benjamin, Sargon of Akkad, came out of the Gamergate directly.
The most famous example for sure. And I mean, even now, right, that at least he could be an example, I think, maybe a test case, because his politics have definitely shifted over more to the right, at least in recent years. I mean, I don't think I hear him call himself an English liberal as much as he used to. But how many, though, within that group of people that reacted and responded or still pay attention to sort of the video and cinematic culture war and politics? How many of them still wish to go back to the 90s? And that becomes the principal problem, is I think that the number of people that recognize the issue people say like you and I, we are in a minority, and that's fine,
Yeah.
because I mean most revolutions or cultural shifts are led by an energized minority, but you know, too many, I think, are perfectly happy to just be placated and hope that something will be good if it just doesn't have X, Y, and Z in it anymore, despite the fact that there is the rest of the alphabet that they have to put up with.
Yeah, and it's and you know, just you know, they're going to come for you eventually. It doesn't matter what area you're in. You know, you've had this cultural. I spoke about cultural entryism, and cultural entryism is basically a group of people who are politically directed, covertly entering organizations, so be that companies or institutions or governments or NGOs or charities, and taking over and influencing, controlling, or destroying these bodies according to their political will. And you find that will inevitably spread to every aspect, because progressivism is about movement. There is no end goal. It has no predetermined end. It doesn't have any demands. It's not like a separatist movement, because however much you might disagree with the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, which wanted Northern Ireland to join the Republic of Ireland and to sort of stop being British territory. They were extremists, they were violent, but they had a very set target, and that was to detach Northern Ireland from Great Britain in order for it to become part of the Republic of Ireland. And they had set goals, they had set targets. Whereas with progressives, it's just movement. It will be movement. They will never be satisfied, because it's essentially it's a tribal loyalty, and it's emotionally driven. It doesn't have pragmatic or practical ends.
And I think that becomes sort of the issue, I think, for dissidents such as ourselves, although I do think that we're moving in a more positive direction when it comes to organization, is that you have this divide, right? Because cultural commentary, writing about it, creating art, articles, videos, whatever, it can be a lucrative industry if you know what you're doing and if you have the right connections, because you can have a pretty good thing going for yourself where you don't have to pretty much challenge yourself to do anything more except take a look at some headlines, take a look at a few things, and rant and rave about it in front of the camera, and then upload, and then watch the ad revenue come in and have, you know, a patron-client relationship. Whereas, you know, the actual issues that need to be addressed require organization, it requires lawfare, it requires actually building institutions. And I think for many of us in both the UK and the United States would actually be a look towards South Africa, especially because, you know, the Anglosphere has been for quite some time now, you know, dealing with unfettered immigration. We are watching the national polity dissolve right in front of us, and the idea of what unifies us is virtually non-existent, because everything is a political battlefield now, which is why I think that sort of biscuit tin nationalism, or even here in the United States, that Norman Rockwell nationalism doesn't exist anymore. And at least what I see from, say, like the Afrikaner population in South Africa do, they have their own sort of civil rights-based organization. It's called AfriForum, and they literally built a university, you know, for their people. And I'm just thinking to myself, that has to be something that's somewhat feasible in the United States or in the UK, to build something, whether it's formal or informal, to at least provide something that isn't going to make students, you know, whether they're white, straight, male, whatever, just to jump through hoops. I mean, there was an article not too long ago that got quite a bit of attention, where, you know, there's black identitarians, ethno-narcissist commentators saying, like, listen, clearly this is white privilege, and where the headline itself was saying that no white students in America will change their race when they submit for college applications, so they actually have a chance of being accepted.
Yeah, but I think the interesting thing about America is that you've got, I mean, you've traditionally had women's colleges and black colleges and Catholic colleges. So you actually do have these parallel institutions which are separate, which in Britain is not so much the case. We've got a couple of art schools, and we've got University of Buckingham, which is an independent university. It's not state-sponsored at all, so the state has no control over the curriculum, and it's slightly more traditionalist, more conservative. And so I think that also already in America, you have this tradition of having these distinct colleges with particular identities serving particular groups. So I think you're already set up quite well for just an expansion of that network.
Well, my pushback would be that women's universities and what is known as HBCUs, which are historically black colleges and universities, are byproducts of an older time. I mean, HBCUs, of course, mainly due to American segregation, which have also existed, right, as a cultural vanguard, I guess, for sort of the black middle and upper classes, because you can take a look at virtually any, successful. You'll see that a lot of them do go to these HBCUs, and women's colleges are somewhat the same way, where it's the difference between men and women, keep them separated. They don't need to be in these spaces. But again, it goes back to sort of the civil rights and disparate impact law. That even places like, say, Liberty University, which is predominantly white, it has a religious bent, it's historically conservative. I mean, there's still a lot of issues about the culture war that exists on its campus. Even more famously, there has been issues over gay rights and or at least all the LGBT stuff in BYU, which is the famous Mormon college in Salt Lake City, Utah. And that is predominantly, a religious and conservative institution that is now coming to face these things, and so they capitulate. And, it doesn't help that you're hiring professors from, other universities that come on board and instill their ideology. You need to gatekeep, and they're not doing that enough. But the issue is that, okay, even if you make a university, say, that is explicitly for what is, systemically the disadvantaged in the United States, it's what has been called its heritage or legacy population, which is the white European families that have immigrated to the U.S. Okay, great. All of a sudden, that is going to face the DOJ Civil Rights Division. It will be under immediate flack for that kind of thing, because again, it's not an equal playing field in the United States. If you come from what is deemed as an oppressive class, which of course, again, the American legacy population, it would be very, very hard to do so, which is why I think what you have seen more recently has been the influx of homeschooling in the United States. I mean, the COVID thing has been an excellent way to have parents really sit down, turn on the computer, sit next to their kid, and realize what in God's name have they been, sending their kids off to for the last several years of their very young lives. So I do think that maybe homeschooling and more alternative ways and means to educate them at a collegiate level is going to happen next. I mean, Academic Agent does it with the academic agency. I know Michael Millerman does it with his university level philosophy courses, which are very good. Both of them, right, I think are a shining example of what may come in the future.
Yeah, I think I wasn't... I was sort of vaguely aware that there was a problem with elite progressivism entering more traditional colleges and Catholic colleges and so forth. And that's a good point. I hadn't considered that. And I know, and we know that if you were to set up, like a based university, I mean, I don't like to say based, but it's a shorthand that we can use. If you set up the based University of Buffalo or whatever, probably not in Buffalo, but you'd get it would get slimed as as a bastion of privilege or white supremacy, even though you wouldn't be choosing on a racial basis. That if you had more, just say more white people there than you would in an average university, because there was not preferential selection, you would necessarily have more white people in that university, and then comparatively it looks like a bastion of white privilege and white supremacy and so forth. And that's obviously going to be a problem in the media, but then the media is going to slime you whatever you do. So you might as well just get on with it.
Well, I mean, you should, and you should ignore it. But at the same time, right, I think that what should come next, right, would be at least lawfare. I mean, if we're going to make if they're going to come after you, right, at least make it an expensive battle for them. Because, I mean, yes, the state does have unlimited resources, but at a certain point, that's a significant amount of investment that they're going to have to put in order for this to happen. Even now, though, right, you're seeing people set up alternatives that aren't, say, the university-based. The IDW crowd, the Bosnian, the Steven Pinkers, the Barry Weisses, they're like, all right, we're going to set up a new college in Austin, Texas, and they're not going to make Austin any better. They're just going to make liberalism worse. But that's the issue, right? As well is that there is this sort of competing collaborator class, the progressives driving the speed limit, and then those that actually want to change things. And of course, they're always going to punch rightward. They're always going to punch any dissident voice, whether you're a liberal or just affected liberal or post-liberal, whatever it may be.
Well, the way I see it is that kind of the IDW, apart from Brett Weinstein, they completely failed on the question of medical restrictions in the last couple of years. I think they kind of made themselves irrelevant because they just simply didn't understand what was going on. They didn't see the authoritarianism. They didn't see the bigger picture. They didn't understand, the intentions of Davos man, as it were, and they completely dropped the ball on that. So I think, who still takes them seriously apart from maybe Brett Weinstein on the question of, who was used pretty good on the question of sort of the medical aspect, the biological aspect.
Well, I think that's the inevitable curse of maybe working within the liberal framework is that you automatically assume good faith. You are assuming that these traditional Enlightenment notions that, okay, we are in this social contract together, the state is meant to provide for the common welfare and the common good, when it is never like for the common good. I mean, oftentimes, yes, elites should be in support of the common good because I think both reactionary and liberal writers will tell you that, listen, like once the elite sort of stop providing the bread and once things really start to get bad, then usually you're going to start seeing people get way more angry than they should. And I mean, yes, we're seeing rioting over that medical aspect all over both here in the US, but all over Western Europe and parts of the UK. I mean, the media is not going to report on it for obvious reasons, but I mean, at a certain point, you would expect, right, that people would respond. And the unfortunate aspect to that is that most have happily complied. And to a point now where we're watching the basket case that is Australia, literally. I mean, if this were 20 years ago, and we were going to say, okay, we're going to pick up Aboriginal Australians and we're going to put them in camps closer to medical centers, you would have significant complaints from, say, an older style of progressive or an older kind of hippie class saying, whoa, this is way too familiar. That's colonialism, bro. But far too many now, after I think just decades of media and sort of this mimetic, to reference Curtis Garvin, sort of this mind virus style of how information is transferred and discussed. Then, I mean, there's that resistance is gone. But it's not taught anymore.
But in a way, it's kind of, I mean, I can say this because I haven't been too badly affected, but it's kind of exciting in that you're seeing all sorts of things being proved true. Like you're seeing elite power theory being proved true in the sense that you've got the majority of the population literally proving that they are NPCs. They literally do want to be led. They want to be told these things. They will follow the high status line. They will follow the mass media line that's fed to them unthinkingly. You've had all of these liberals, you've had these feminists who have been saying for years and years, my body, my choice. And it's instantly gone as soon as it comes to certain other medical procedures in the last couple of years. It's like, oh, no, you don't have a choice anymore. You have to be controlled. The state needs to interfere with your biology, with your medical choices, your medical confidentiality. It's completely gone, and it's kind of wonderful to say, oh, this isn't they never really believe these things. They don't have any principles. They're just acting like a herd.
I think that the person who is probably smiling from his grave is probably Aristotle. We can go back now thousands of years and just be like, the Aristotelian concept of the slave mentality has been very much proven true. I mean, and you're right. I think the MPC is perfect for this day and age, because I mean, how many people there's so much data out there, and I mean, yes, there's a replication crisis, but certain people don't have an inner monologue. They don't talk to themselves in their mind, which I think is weird, because I talk to myself in my mind. I'm like, how do you not have conversations with yourself mentally to go down the checklist?
People think, but then maybe they're not actually thinking the way we think. I guess they're not.
I can't put myself in that mindset. I don't know what that would be like. It's just we're in these bifurcated sense of just mental states. But on top of that, right, people that can't visualize an apple in their hand and like move it around, and that on top of that, right, the whole idea of agreeableness that even Jordan Peterson has talked about for years. I mean, we have this society of highly agreeable, highly they don't critically think, despite the fact that you're supposed to be taught critical thinking skills, and now the New York Times tells you don't think critically, and they don't have an internal monologue, and they don't think things through. Of course, that's perfect for them to follow the state, to follow the rules, to trust the science and credentialism. But the other thing that came to my mind as soon as you were talking about sort of this sort of accepting paternalistic figure was, throughout the last century, it was starting especially in the 1960s, when there's sort of the women's lib, the sort of, I know in 1967 the UK decriminalized homosexuality, but throughout the 60s to today, right, 60 years from now, there has been an increase in single-parent households, no-fault divorce that Peter Hitchens likes to decry. And all of a sudden you have like millions of people, generations of people raised without a father, or raised without a two-parent household. And I wonder how much that has an impact. Now I'm just pathologizing, which I hate doing, but it raises a question of, how much does that have an impact culturally and generationally, where they'll accept that paternalistic daddy government.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what happens is when you have a feminized society, you have a kind of the state becomes the father, albeit a feminine father, a father who's directing his children to be in a sort of tyrannical way, but in a gentle, persuading way, in a way that, we're just protecting minorities, we're just protecting the vulnerable, we're just being nice to migrants who are only traveling over here for absolute, because they've seen such terrible things. They're definitely not economic migrants. And once you have a feminized society, and you destroy the institutions of the church and the traditional family, the state, people have to turn to the state, because they don't have a father figure, they don't have a husband, they don't have a nuclear family. And I'm not saying that all nuclear families are the right solution for everyone, but it's certainly society-wide. It does replicate good results in terms of lower crime, better motivation, better mental health, to have strong families.
Well, as the phrase goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And
but then it's in the advantage. It's to the advantage of the elites to have a broken society, to have a leaderless sort of mass who are dependent on the state. This is perfect for them, because then the more things that they offer to do, to educate, to give you, to inculcate values, to provide income, to provide jobs, to direct you socially, the more that population is amenable. And especially the vast majority of them being NPCs, they're absolutely amenable to that sort of manipulation and control.
Well, I was referring to, say, like the traditional aspect of a family living together in not single parent homes. But no, you're absolutely right. If things are purposefully broken, then it is easier to manipulate and control. And I think that kind of brings us to the discussion of the age of big government, or big versus small. My desire, of course, I would love to go back to like 1789, where, you know, we have this constitution, but a majority of the power is vested within state government here in the United States, where there isn't a school system that's federalized. There isn't billions of dollars that are being brought in to where if you don't comply with what we're asking for, you don't get this money, which is coercive federalism. But you know, you live now in a state, and you'll see this conversation a lot when it comes to, say, the debate over war powers, right? The traditional debate is that Congress constitutionally has the right to declare war. We haven't declared war in forever. And we watched President Truman sort of eviscerate any idea when it came to the Korean War, not to mention that war can happen in an instant. So there's this debate over constitutionality, but we live in a world of the nuclear age, so we give the president more leeway and executive power to do it. And I think you're seeing the same thing about all aspects of governmental power. Like, I would love to see the state smashed and destroyed in its overarching ability. But until you can get to that position, I think that the levers of power need to be seized, because we even saw this, right, between, say, AA, the academic agent, and the distributist when discussing issues over centrists. The centrist biggest complaint, or at least what they'll say prima facie, is that we don't want state power to mandate or enforce morality. But that's happening now to enforce a morality. It's happening now to enforce an ideology. It's happening, and it has been happening for decades. This objection is so asinine, where you're going to have to use that power for good, and to use that power to accomplish what you want to achieve, because we are not governed by a piece of paper and consensus. You are governed by those that have the power and the will to power to govern and control.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you've got is it's just a question of do you want to directly impose morality from the top, or are you going to do it indirectly through schools, through teaching, through mass media, through through nudges? You know, the whole idea of nudge politics is where you just set up a behavioral unit, and you know, you provide some certain incentives and certain disincentives. If you just make it more difficult for people to walk in a certain way along a sidewalk, then people will naturally go to the slightly easier way, and that way you don't have to necessarily tell them that you have to walk on one side rather than the other side. You just kind of make it slightly easier for them to do it on one side and more difficult to do it on the other side, so they tend to follow that. And so you don't need any laws to do that. You just hand it over to a bunch of behavioral scientists who have like a think tank at a university, and you can get them to do it for you. You don't need to pass any laws. You know?
A wonderful consequence of sort of this technocratic managerial state that we live in. And it's funny when you think about it, because in the idea, this utopian idea of a society ran by experts, a society ran by the top of their field, the clever aspect, I think, of how history is taught these days, which is not, we can have that's a discussion for another day, but they'll tell you, oh, well, like technocracy fell out of favor. We did this whole other thing, but it's just like, okay, well, it opens up his copy of The Managerial Revolution by James Burnham, reads The People's Pottage by Garrett Garrett, and you're like, no, technocracy stayed. We just started calling it something else with bureaucracy. And that's where we're at, is that you can always offhand it into it. And I think, as Yarvin kind of explained it perfectly on Tucker Carlson, that these people striving to change the world, to have influence, is just a really cutesy way of saying that they want power. And what a better way to seize power than to, of course, be contracted out to tell the state, the sovereign entity, what to do.
And the soft English liberal in me says, but you see, the way we can combat this is by sort of harnessing democracy. But of course, harnessing democracy, there will be someone leading you. There will be someone, with the reins, with the bridle, fitting the bridle so that they can control you and direct you. But yeah, I mean, why not say, we need more democratic oversight. We need the small person making decisions, and and I honestly believe that. But I think that's a very persuasive argument to try and escape this technocracy. I mean, how practical it is, and I think probably in reality it would never happen, because it never has happened. But I do think that it's worth advocating for democracy and for self-determination, even if what you get is something slightly less than that ideal.
I mean, liberty can be achieved, but liberty can only be achieved with order. And I think that everyone in their mind gets very upset due to both, historical narratives and what they see in the popular culture, that, order is necessary by means of men that are willing to do things, and by a man who is willing to lead and govern that. And immediately and we've seen this over the last 5-6 years now, about the idea of a fascistic strongman and machismo politics in the U.S. and abroad in the West. And but that's how you stabilize and achieve order. And of course, anytime that they do seize power, right, they inevitably fail to stop the bureaucracy or the technocracy that is, technically under their control but isn't. We saw this with we saw this with Trump. We saw this with President Nixon. Anytime that someone wishes to challenge this institution, whether it's the establishment, the deep state, the cathedral, whatever you want to call it, they are destroyed. They are blown out of the water.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that actually in terms of liberty and freedom, you often have more liberty and freedom and more privacy and more control under a king or under a dictator, because I think what you understand is, I mean, if you sort of study primate behavior, you find that the leader, the alpha male, the leader, controls when he is at least a little bit generous, when he has trusted underlings, when he distributes, when he gets the lion's share, but he does distribute the food amongst the subordinates. So you do have this, the canny leader knows where to delegate, knows when to make concessions. They're not the socialist idea that, you had, tyrannical kings, going riding through villages and, picking up maidens and carrying them away. And, it really wasn't, it was much more of a negotiation. It was much more of a conforming to tradition, understanding your limits, because kings often had very limited power, and power was delegated further down the line. And I do think that, we would benefit from having a different system, but yeah, how do we get to that? Well, I mean, you're right that the deep state, the POSD civil service is naturally working against any particular sort of traditionalist or populist. At the moment, we've got there's finally it has hit the news in Britain about illegal immigrants, because we have in the past we always thought of the English Channel as being sort of like a defense as being some sort of proper kind of limitation in migration, but now of course this is being breached by gangs of people smugglers who are putting economic migrants on boats, and they're getting them across the channel, which is only about sort of 25-30 miles wide. It's a very busy shipping lane, but it's quite narrow, so it's possible to get over essentially in dinghies in good weather. And so suddenly this has finally become news, because we had a recent terrorist attack, which is probably done by one of these migrants, a supposed convert to Christianity from Islam, but he apparently was still attending mosque until very recently, which is a peculiar thing for a Christian to be doing. But anyways, hit the news, and suddenly people are talking about, well, actually, you've got all these human rights lawyers who are working against the common interest of the government, which really would like to try and reduce illegal migration, just simply, I mean, mainly for sort of optics reasons, but it's also working against the best interests of the British public, and also against the best interests of British migrants who got here legally, because they feel that their position is being undermined by illegal migrants who are sort of discrediting them and causing problems. So finally, there's this realization that, oh, actually, you've got this large cadre of lawyers, human rights lawyers, migration lawyers, and social workers who are working against the best wishes of the government and the intentions of the majority of the population. And they're actually supporting and encouraging migrants and bringing them over and allowing them to stay, and delaying all sort of chances of getting them repatriated. So I think that's a good example.
Oh, we have the same thing here in the United States along the southern border with Mexico. You'll have a numerous amount of quote-unquote Catholic charities that will work furiously to work and bring people over. And, the money trail will always lead you into some interesting directions. But no, yeah.
Yes, right. Yes, I can think of a particularly big name. Yes. I'm not going to say it.
Of course not. Let's not engage in some canards or dog whistle, shall we?
or right-wing talking points. I think we've been covering too many right-wing talking points. We've exposed ourselves.
Oh, of course. Heaven forbid they find this sub 5K channel, but yeah. But no, I think that kind of brings us to a discussion, because we've talked about institutions, we've talked about political evolution, and as well as culture. But there's been a conversation on the right, and I'm sure that you're aware of maybe the Passage Prize that's been organized by a gentleman named Loman.
Oh yes, yeah.
I do know a few artists with right-leaning ideas. We're talking. There's the infamous, famous Zero H.P. Lovecraft. There's Gio Panichetti, who's also a painter and woodcutter. But there's not a lot, at least in my limited, and of course John D. From Academic Agent Circle. There's that's like 4 people that I can name off the top of my head that are sort of on the right, that do sort of the traditional venues of art. I mean, how would you encourage people? Because I mean, art, of course, culture helps determine politics, aesthetics help determine our political and cultural views. I mean, how does the right get more involved into that sphere?
I'd say, first of all, I think there's a huge reservoir of people who would love to be either traditional artists, or they would like their work to be apolitical, and for them, for their work to be accepted just for being good in its own terms. So if it is abstract art, that it's good abstract art, that they've worked really hard on it, that it is particularly distinctive and effective, or if they wanted to work as a traditional portraitist or whatever. That I think that there is a huge reservoir of people who want that, and there's a great yearning also, especially amongst young people, when they want to learn. They do want to learn the skills. They don't necessarily want to be taught in sort of conceptual stuff or art theory or whatever. They do want to learn skills because they have a passion for making images, for making art, for using color. So I think the way that you encourage this is by, I mean, I know a lot of people are sniffy about this, but you do have to put money into it, and you do have to make it financially viable. So what you would have is you'd have prizes. You'd set up prizes for traditional art, or however you want to decide or discern it, or if you want to say sort of native-born American artists or native-born British artists. So you don't have an international element. So you're actually restricting it somehow. And you can say, traditional art, or arts, or watercolor, or pastel, or oil painting, or figurative painting, or figurative drawing, or something. So you could have prizes for that. You could have stipends. There are a few traditional art colleges in all over the world. There are still some in America and Britain. So you could have actually put some money into these. You could set up like a chair. You could fund sort of a chair of traditional art at this or that place. You could provide bursaries or scholarships for students. You could arrange exhibitions. You could have publications. There's all sorts of ways. In the arts, it's actually fantastically open because it's not actually regulated at all. You could have someone who's conservative or right-wing or reactionary coming in and saying, I like this kind of art, I want to support it. It might be a particular person, or it might be a class of people, or it might be a particular, stone carving. It might be a particular tradition that I want to support. And then you back it with money. And this could be something as small as, $400, $500 annual prize at your local arts fair or whatever. Or it might go up to, more. You might want to give larger prizes, or you might want to have a purchase prize, which is always a great incentive to get people to make work. You could commission work for a local church or a civic building, or for just your own home, because you don't have to deal with any bureaucracy. There's all sorts of ways to incentivize it. Some of it comes down to money, some of it comes down to community, because if you can set up a group, a club, a society which promotes particular style of art or particular regional tradition, you can get a sense of community. Even if it's just something as small as doing like a life drawing class where you're working with a model, and you just get a group of amateur artists come in and they pay, $5 for a session, and you can pay for a warm room somewhere and pay the model. And it's as simple as that.
Well, with that last point, I was going to ask, out of just curiosity, just how is the idea of, say, apprenticeship or something along those lines, is that viable these days?
Well, they do kind of exist in an unofficial way, because you'll find that if you look at some of the big artists, like a Jeff Koons, or it would have been Warhol back in the day, or a Damien Hirst, they all had or have assistants. So it's basically, sometimes they got 5 assistants, sometimes they got 10 or 20. And I think that Damien Hirst at one stage had about 50. He basically had a factory making his art, and he would approve certain designs. So he would actually have assistants. And in a way, they are in effect apprentices, although how that necessarily translates into the rest of their working life, I don't know. I'm not sure that being an assistant to Damien Hirst necessarily gives you any advantages after you stop being his assistant. I'm not sure that there's a necessary pathway from assistant to master artist in the way that there used to be a pathway from apprentice to master. It's tricky. I think without guilds, you probably can't resurrect it. You could try and institute guilds, but then that would tend to require a bit more legislation. You'd have to kind of restrict people's ability to practice in that. And I, as a sort of more libertarian-leaning person, would have difficulties with that. And you could also see that being paused as well. You could see that becoming like just an arm of the state.
Potentially. As important as gatekeeping is, right? I think that attempts to do so, all it would take would be one complaint of discrimination, and you're done for. Because both in the UK and the United States especially, the idea of freedom of association is a long dead concept, despite the fact that it should very much come back, and it should
it's problematic for many so-called liberals, because they don't really understand. It's a double-edged sword, or double-sided coin. Yeah.
Well, of course, because the moment you start talking about freedom of association and people operating independently or separately from everyone else, you're immediately called a racist. And here in the U.S., a gentleman named by Christopher Caldwell with a D talked about this when it comes to just the idea that America does have a second constitution. It's the civil rights law. It's sort of the founding aspect. So the idea of people not being integrated, or the idea that people can independently and freely associate with whoever. And the last real vestige of that in the United States is churches. America, of course, being majority Protestant, a lot of Protestant churches, a lot of churches for any religion are primarily like mono-ethnic. And you see this with like black churches. Jews are primarily within temple. They're Jews, right? They're not particularly any other group. It's all the same, right? And so that's like the last vestige of it. And everywhere else, it's that's disparate impact, that's discrimination, and you'll be sued. So no, I think you're right there that would cause a problem. But doing it informally, like you had mentioned, taking people in or putting the money out, I think is essential, because there's not enough of right-wing artists such as yourself.
Yeah, it's a matter of incentive. It's a matter of opportunity, and I think you can win over a lot of people who are going to be like, if you want a new governing culture, your non-governing elites, you're going to have to give them they'll subscribe to you as long as you're providing them with meaningful work and meaningful income. So you'll have lots of people who are kind of, I wouldn't say NPCs, but they're kind of politically uncommitted. They will come over and they will do traditional art if they see that there is some status attached to it, so that that this is the favored style of the elite, and also they're making an income from it. So you're giving them enough opportunities for them to provide for themselves and potentially a family as well. And once you do those, you'll be able to win over loads and loads of people. Absolutely, they will have no problem at all. I mean, as we've seen with the medical situation over the last 2 years, people can swing completely in directions that they ostensibly completely rejected only a couple of weeks before. They can be swung. So I think, if you provide enough incentives, and they don't need to be, and they don't need to necessarily be any punitive measures. You can have just incentives to make money and to make connections and to become a high status or high prestige member of an associate of the new elite, or maybe an alternative elite, which you think is not necessarily going to take over, but is certainly worth backing or being associated with.
Well, on the question of income, I when we're talking about assistants and associates and whatnot, I mean, for all the artists that participate, I guess my question would be, as someone who is totally not in the art world, I couldn't draw or do anything like that to save my life. I mean, how common or how historically recent is the starving artist sort of phrase and meme?
Oh, well, that came about in the sort of the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and that came about basically with the decline of guilds. So you couldn't be a member of the guild, you couldn't practice being an artist unless you'd have to have done an apprenticeship. And some people actually stayed apprentices or assistants. They never actually became masters. They were skilled artists. They were just always working under the aegis in the studio of a master. But the usual thing would you would be an apprentice, and then you'd be a master by producing a master work or a masterpiece, which is where the phrase comes from. And then you would achieve your master status, but you'd have to pay an annual fee to be on the rolls, the guild rolls, which is the list of members. And once that kind of declined and people went to art school and became basically freelancers, and they were no longer part of a guild, then you started to have starving artists, because they were not working to commissions. They were just making art that they thought would sell, and they're not necessarily very good judges of what will sell. They're not necessarily good judges of what the market wants or of their own abilities, and we know this in all fields, not just art. But there's some people who are kind of delusional, and that's how you end up with, and also oversupply of artists, because don't have to be a member of the guild. You don't actually have to have an academic education. You don't have to have passed an apprenticeship. So oversupply of artists, undersupply of patrons or consumers, and very variable technical quality or technical ability of artists led to unsuccessful artists, who are essentially these starving artists that you mentioned.
Well, on the question then of success, and since we do see a lot of starving artists out there, left wing or apolitical, what would you attribute to your success as an artist?
Well, I mean, in the degree that I have success, I guess it's down to hard work. It's being self-critical. So it's sort of, keeping artwork back that I'm not quite happy with, destroying a fair amount. Also looking at the masters and trying to not to emulate them, but to take lessons from the Renaissance and Baroque and Impressionist and modernist painters as well. Doing a lot of looking at art that really sharpens your judgment, and it improves your skill as well. So I think that it's sort of, no magic formula. It's just sort of hard work, looking, being self-critical, thinking quite hard, thinking about how you're going to present the work as well, not just sort of doing sort of scattershot displays, but trying to get together bodies of work, so groups of landscape, groups of portraits, and sort of, you know, trying to think intelligently about how you can present this work, and also being able to discuss it is useful. I try not to write too much about my own work, but you know, having a little bit of verbal fluency helps. But I don't do conceptual stuff. I don't like explain stuff. I won't give you a meaning. I'm not going to tell you how you're supposed to understand stuff. I kind of step back and I let people make their own interpretations, which I think kind of helps. It's out of fashion, but I think it does help make connections with viewers.
Well, I think that gives us a very good transition then to let people know where we can find you. I know that you had mentioned your website, but I know that you also write for Bournebrook magazine, and I think you've been on RT as well.
Yes, I write for RT, which is Russia Today. That's more sort of journalistic stuff. I write for Spiked on questions regarding mainly to do with censorship. Whatever you think of Spiked, they're pretty good on the issue of opposing censorship. And I'm sort of a freelance contributor. I don't sort of have any editorial input there. You can find my writing on Bournebrook magazine. My main blog is alexanderadams.wordpress.com, and that has reviews of books and exhibitions. And you can find my art on alexanderadams.art.
And all of that will be in the link in the description, so everyone can find your work, find your journalistic writings and opines on art and censorship. Mr. Adams, thank you so much for having the time out of your day to come over and talk with me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prudentialist.
And to everyone in the audience listening, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you all next time. Be prudent, everybody.